You're not talking to them anymore. But in your head, the conversation never ended. You win arguments they don't even know they lost. You rehearse replies, imagine reactions, rewrite endings that already happened, and you call it thinking, but it's actually being trapped. What if I told you the real problem is not the person you're arguing with, but the part of you that refuses to let them go? If you've ever found yourself stuck in mental arguments that never end, pause for a second. Don't try to fix it. Just notice it. Because awareness is not about stopping thoughts by force. It's about no longer feeding them. Stay with this, because what comes next is how to completely break the cycle and reclaim your mental silence. The mind often continues conversations long after they have ended in real life, because the brain does not naturally separate past interaction from present experience when strong emotion is involved. When a conversation leaves an emotional mark, such as anger, embarrassment, rejection, or injustice, the brain treats it like an unresolved task. Instead of closing the loop, it keeps replaying fragments of what was said and what could have been said differently. This happens because the nervous system is trying to regain a sense of control over something that felt uncomfortable or unfinished in the moment. Even when the external situation is completely over, the internal processing remains active. The brain uses memory not just as storage, but as simulation. It reruns conversations like scenarios, testing alternative outcomes in an attempt to reduce emotional tension. This is why people often imagine better replies hours or even days later, as if the mind is trying to fix the past through repeated mental rehearsal. The stronger the emotional charge, the more vivid and repetitive these internal dialogues become. Another reason this continues is because the brain does not strictly label imagined speech versus real speech. When you replay someone's words, your nervous system can respond almost as if the interaction is happening again. Heart rate, tension, and emotional reactions may return briefly, reinforcing the illusion that the situation still matters in the present moment. This creates a loop where thinking leads to feeling, and feeling leads to more thinking. There is also an identity layer involved. If a situation threatened your self-image, respect, or boundaries, the mind keeps revisiting it to protect that identity. It tries to restore dignity by mentally winning the argument or correcting what felt wrong. But instead of resolution, it often creates deeper attachment to the event itself. Over time, this habit becomes automatic. The mind starts replaying conversations even when there is no longer emotional urgency, simply because it has learned the pattern. What begins as an attempt to process emotions slowly turns into a mental reflex that keeps the past active inside the present, making silence in the mind feel difficult even when everything outside has already ended. Internal arguments are usually not driven by logic, even though they feel like reasoning in the moment. They are primarily emotional reactions that were never fully expressed or resolved during the original interaction. When something triggers feelings like anger, hurt, shame, or frustration, the emotional brain reacts faster than the thinking brain. Later, when the situation is over, the logical part of the mind tries to revisit it, but what actually reappears is the emotional charge attached to it. That is why these internal arguments feel so intense and real, even though no new information is being produced. Instead of analyzing facts, the mind is replaying emotional discomfort and trying to regulate it. The arguments inside your head are often your psyche attempting to discharge tension, not to discover truth. You may notice that the same points are repeated over and over, but slightly rewritten each time, as if the mind is trying different versions of the same emotional response to finally reach relief. This repetition is not progress. It is emotional looping disguised as reasoning. Another key factor is that during real conversations, people often hold back what they truly want to say. Social norms, fear of conflict, or hesitation prevent full expression. Those unspoken words remain stored as incomplete emotional energy. Later, in private mental space, the brain gives you permission to say everything, which creates the illusion of a debate. But because there is no real exchange happening, there is no resolution either, only continuous self-generated responses that keep the emotional system activated. These internal arguments also feel logical because the brain constructs justifications around emotions. It builds narratives that support what you are feeling, not necessarily what is objectively accurate. So instead of neutral analysis, you get emotionally biased reasoning that always circles back to the same core feeling. Over time, the mind begins to confuse this emotional processing with problem solving. You believe you are thinking through the situation, but you are actually re-experiencing it in different forms. This keeps the emotional system active long after the original event has ended, making it harder to detach and return to a calm mental state that is not driven by unfinished emotional reactions. Replaying conflicts in the mind repeatedly strengthens emotional attachment because the brain interprets repetition as importance. Whenever a situation is revisited mentally, the neural pathways associated with that memory become more active and more easily triggered in the future. This means that even if the original event was brief, the act of constantly thinking about it gives it more psychological weight than it originally had. Instead of fading with time, the experience becomes more deeply encoded, almost as if it is still ongoing. Each time you replay a conflict, you are not just remembering it. You are reactivating the emotional state attached to it. The body responds as if the situation is happening again, releasing similar stress signals, tension, and emotional arousal. This repeated activation creates a feedback loop where the mind links the person or situation with strong internal reactions. Over time, the brain begins to associate that person not only with the event itself, but with the emotional intensity that follows every replay. Attachment grows because unresolved emotion keeps the mental connection alive. Even negative emotions like anger or frustration maintain a form of psychological bond. The mind prefers a strong emotional connection, even if it is uncomfortable, over no connection at all. So by repeatedly revisiting the conflict, you are unintentionally sustaining the relationship in your internal world long after it has ended externally. Another layer is the illusion of control. When you replay conflicts, you often imagine different outcomes where you respond better, win the argument, or regain dignity. This creates a sense of temporary empowerment, but it also reinforces the importance of the original event. The more you try to fix it in your mind, the more central it becomes in your emotional landscape. With time, the person or situation becomes a mental reference point for unresolved feelings. Instead of being a single moment in the past, it turns into an active emotional structure that the mind returns to automatically, shaping how similar future experiences are interpreted, influencing reactions, expectations, and sensitivity toward new interactions that feel even slightly related. Most internal arguments are not actually about truth, fairness, or finding the correct conclusion. At their core, they are about control. When a situation triggers emotional discomfort, the mind does not immediately aim to understand it objectively. Instead, it tries to regain a sense of power over what felt unpredictable or painful. In real interactions, you cannot control what the other person says or how they behave, but in your imagination, you can rewrite their words, change their tone, and decide your response. This creates an illusion of control that feels temporarily satisfying. The mind keeps returning to these arguments because control is psychologically comforting. When something happens that makes you feel dismissed, misunderstood, or powerless, the brain treats it as a threat to your emotional stability. Replaying the scenario becomes a way to regain balance, as if rerunning the conversation could undo the emotional impact. Even though nothing changes in reality, the internal experience gives a brief sense of reclaiming authority over the situation. However, this process is not truly about resolving the event. It is about resisting the discomfort of not having controlled the outcome. That is why the same argument is often replayed with different variations. In one version, you respond calmly. In another, you become more assertive. In another, you completely dominate the exchange. Each version is an attempt to repair the feeling of power that was lost in the original moment. The deeper issue is that the mind confuses mental dominance with actual resolution. It believes that if you can win the argument in your head, then the emotional discomfort should disappear. But instead, it reinforces the importance of control itself, making the original event more central in your emotional system. The more you try to control it internally, the more control it seems to demand. This cycle continues because control gives a temporary reduction in anxiety, even if it is imagined. The brain prefers this temporary relief over accepting uncertainty or emotional discomfort. So it keeps returning to the same internal debates, not because they lead to clarity, but because they momentarily restore a feeling of stability that was disrupted in the original experience, keeping the mind locked in repetition rather than release. The brain confuses repetition with importance because of how memory and learning systems are designed. In the nervous system, anything that is repeated frequently becomes more strongly encoded, regardless of whether it is useful, healthy, or even accurate. The brain does not automatically judge content for emotional well-being. It prioritizes patterns. So when a thought, memory, or conversation is replayed again and again, the brain interprets it as something significant that needs to be retained and revisited. This happens through a process where neural connections strengthen each time a specific thought pattern is activated. The more a mental loop is repeated, the easier it becomes to trigger again, almost like a pathway in the mind becoming wider and more accessible. What starts as a single moment of reflection can turn into an automatic habit of replaying the same scenario, even without conscious intention. Emotion plays a major role in this process. When repetition is combined with strong feelings like anger, sadness, or frustration, the brain treats it as high-priority information. It assumes that anything emotionally charged must be important for survival or future protection. As a result, it stores these memories more vividly and brings them back more often, even when there is no real benefit in revisiting them. This creates a false signal of significance. Just because something keeps appearing in your thoughts does not mean it deserves attention. It only means your brain has learned a repetitive pattern around it. The mind then mistakenly assumes that if it is recurring, it must require further analysis or resolution, which leads to even more thinking about the same situation. Over time, this loop becomes self-reinforcing. The more you revisit a thought, the more important it feels, and the more important it feels, the more your mind returns to it. This is how mental repetition transforms into perceived emotional priority, even when the original event is no longer relevant. The brain continues treating old experiences as active material simply because repetition has trained it to do so, keeping attention locked on familiar patterns instead of allowing them to naturally fade and lose psychological weight. Inner debates drain mental energy because they continuously activate the same cognitive and emotional circuits without producing any real outcome or resolution. Every time you argue with someone in your head, your brain behaves as if it is performing a real task that requires attention, language processing, emotional regulation, and memory retrieval. This consumes mental resources that could otherwise be used for present awareness, decision-making, or rest. Unlike productive thinking, which moves toward a solution or action, internal arguments recycle the same material repeatedly. The mind keeps reconstructing the event, reinterpreting what was said, and generating responses that have no impact on reality. This creates a form of cognitive overload where the brain is working hard but not progressing anywhere. Because there is no external closure, the system remains partially activated, as if an unfinished task is still open in the background. Emotionally, these debates also keep the nervous system engaged. Each replay can trigger stress responses similar to the original moment, such as tension, irritation, or anxiety. This means the body is repeatedly entering a state of mild alertness, even when nothing is actually happening in the environment. Over time, this constant low-level activation contributes to fatigue because the system is never fully allowed to settle into rest. Present moment clarity is reduced because attention is divided between what is happening now and what is happening in the mind. Instead of fully processing current sensory input, conversations, or tasks, part of awareness is stuck in an imagined dialogue. This split attention weakens focus and makes even simple activities feel less clear or more effortful. The mind also becomes less efficient at distinguishing what is real and what is imagined when these internal debates become habitual. Thoughts about the past start to feel as urgent as present situations, which blurs mental prioritization. As a result, the brain keeps shifting between internal scenarios and external reality, never fully committing to either state. With repeated engagement, this pattern becomes automatic, and the mind begins generating arguments even in quiet moments without intention. Silence feels filled with mental noise, and awareness of the present becomes fragmented into pieces of remembered conflict and imagined replies that continue cycling in the background without natural stopping point. Observing thoughts without engaging means creating a mental distance between you and the internal dialogue instead of automatically participating in it. Normally, when a thought appears, especially an emotionally charged one, the mind treats it as something that requires response. So if an argument starts replaying in your head, you immediately begin answering it, defending yourself, correcting the other person, or imagining outcomes. This engagement is what keeps the cycle alive, because every response gives the thought more energy and continuation. When you shift into observation, you begin to notice the thought as an event happening in the mind, rather than a command that requires action. The difference is subtle but powerful. Instead of, "I am in this argument again," the experience becomes, "I am noticing that my mind is producing an argument." This shift breaks identification. The thought is still present, but it is no longer merged with your sense of self. At first, thoughts may continue strongly because the habit of engagement is deeply conditioned. The mind is used to reacting immediately, especially to emotional triggers. But when you resist the urge to respond internally, something important changes. The thought begins to lose momentum because it is no longer being reinforced by reaction. Like a conversation where one side stops replying, the internal dialogue starts to weaken naturally. Observation also reduces emotional intensity. When you are fully engaged in an internal argument, your body reacts as if the situation is real. But when you observe without participation, you create a gap where emotion can be felt without being amplified. The feeling may arise, but it does not escalate into a full narrative. It remains a passing experience rather than a structured mental story. Over time, this practice trains the brain to recognize thoughts as temporary mental events instead of realities that must be acted upon. The mind starts to slow down because fewer thoughts are being fed with attention. Internal arguments lose their grip, not because they are forcibly stopped, but because they are no longer sustained through engagement, allowing natural mental quietness to emerge gradually as attention returns to the present moment, instead of staying trapped in repeated inner conversations. Peace begins when you stop replying to people who are not actually speaking, because the real exhaustion does not come from the original conversation, but from the ongoing internal continuation of it. When you keep responding in your mind, you are essentially keeping the relationship, conflict, or emotional event alive in an imaginary space where it cannot evolve or resolve. This creates a false sense that something still needs to be fixed, explained, or defended, even when the external situation is completely finished. The mind continues these replies because it is trying to complete emotional closure. However, closure cannot be achieved through endless mental dialogue. Each imagined response feels like progress, but it actually reopens the loop again. The more you answer in your head, the more your brain assumes the conversation is still active, which prevents it from naturally settling into silence. In this way, internal replying becomes the very thing that blocks peace. When you stop responding internally, something important happens in the nervous system. The emotional charge begins to lose its fuel. Thoughts may still appear, but they no longer develop into full conversations. Without your participation, the mental script cannot continue on its own. It is your attention and engagement that give it structure, meaning, and emotional intensity. This stopping is not about suppression or forcing thoughts away. It is about non-participation. The difference is that suppression creates resistance, while non-response creates distance. When you do not reply, you are not fighting the thought. You are simply not adding to it. That absence of reaction is what allows the mental noise to dissolve gradually rather than intensify. Over time, the brain learns that not every thought deserves engagement. It begins to recognize that silence is not emptiness, but release. The urge to respond weakens because it is no longer reinforced. What once felt like unfinished conversations slowly loses urgency, and the emotional system stops treating them as active threats or unresolved tasks. Eventually, the mind returns to its natural state of stillness more often, where thoughts arise and fade without pulling you into dialogue, and peace becomes less of an effort and more of a default condition emerging when internal responses are no longer given power or continuation.